When Martin Amis published his first novels in the 1970s, including The Rachel Papers and Dead Babies, few headline writers could resist the pun, "The sun also rises." The long shelf of novels by Kingsley Amis, including Lucky Jim, now had to make room for work by another author from the family. The Sun went on to write Money, a transatlantic satire which is now considered one of the key books of the 80s and has just been adapted as a BBC drama. And he's continued to attract headlines. In the 90s, coverage of his divorce, emergency dentistry, and a series of family deaths, including that of Kingsley, led Martin to write a memoir, Experience. There was recently another media flurry over his comments about Islam and on feminism, the theme of his latest and 14th novel, The Pregnant Widow, in which a young man behaves badly towards women during a holiday in Italy. Amis has acknowledged that the self-destruction of one of the female characters was inspired by the emotional troubles and early death, at the age of 46, of his sister Sally. In a recent review of the last book by the American writer John Updike, and then again in a debate at Manchester University, you suggested novelists almost invariably get worse as they get older and the later books can be embarrassing. It's quite a risky gambit for a novelist of 60 with a new book out. Did it reflect any nervousness about your own curve?
It's on my mind a lot because it's a sort of recent negative eureka on my part. I found it and I don't want it, which is coming to realize that it does seem to be this almost invariable downward curve. It's a modern phenomenon. Dickens died at 59, Shakespeare 54, Jane Austen at 41. There was no question in the past of the talent dying before the body, but we can see it in certain examples of writers who did hang on for a bit, like Tolstoy. The early novella, The Death of Ivan Illich, is immortal. The late novella, The Kreutzer Sonata, is dreadful on every level. I'm going to be haunted by it, I'm sure, and I wish I wasn't so self-aware about it. But for the time being, I've just finished a long novel. I've almost completed another novel, and I know exactly what the novel after that's going to be. So after a great struggle with this book, I'm in remission.
You refer to this in your memoir, Experience, and you've become part of this small repertory company. Probably Salman Rushdie is the only other novelist, and for other reasons, who newspapers just write about. They think our readers will know who these people are, they'll want to know. In your case, it was partly, perhaps even largely, because of being the son of a famous novelist, Kingsley Amis.
That's, I'm sure that's it. And it's been a strange ride, really, from the 70s to now, in that when you start out, everyone is almost embarrassingly generous in that climate. Anyway, I'm not sure how it would go down now, but and everyone's saying, oh, it must have been very difficult, and in fact, it wasn't. It slightly eased things, being the son of. But later on, it changed. Now, I don't think I should be penalized for being the son of Kingsley Amis, because I didn't have any say in it. But I think that's what happens. And thus I became the English novelist about whom you can say anything you like. On the other hand, I can think of no other examples in literature of a father, a parent and a child producing bodies of work that are about the same weight, roughly. In most cases, sort of David Updike and others, they write one novel or one book of stories, and that seems to satisfy whatever it was that made them want to write, a certain emulousness, rivalrousness with the parent. It was nothing to do with my father, my starting to write. It was always, I always knew I was in it for the long haul, that this would be my life. So maybe, if there is a privilege, it's that I've never taken what's said about me too seriously, because writing isn't a sort of magical profession for me, as it must be to, I think of my friends, son of a businessman, son of a school teacher, son of an army man. To find yourself a writer must be extraordinary. But to me, it never was extraordinary, because nothing is more banal than what your father does.
I was also very struck, looking back, to an extent that I hadn't realised before, that if we look at your 14 work of fiction so far, from Rachel Papers 1973 to Pregnant Widow 2010, there is a recurrent structure. In a large number of them, there is a man in pursuit of a woman. It's true of Money, it's true of London Fields, and he will probably be humiliated in the course of this quest.
Yes, I taught Philip Roth's first novel, novella, Goodbye Columbus. If you remember, it was filmed in a quite memorable scene of the girl saying at the swimming pool, "Will you hold my sunglasses?" Then he goes straight home and calls her up. And I said to my class, I said, "That's pretty flash, isn't it?" I said, "That's the difference between an American novel and a British novel. A British novel, the first 40 pages would have been about him plucking up the courage to give her a call." We are, as a nation, sort of uniquely diffident. If you look at the small ads in an American journal, you'll say, you know, handsome, slim, non-smoker wants to meet, you know. In the British equivalent is chain-smoking, alcoholic, out of work, you know, overweight, chap, age 50, wants. We are a diffident nation in these matters, and I reflect that, I helplessly reflect that. I think we're full of nerves and scruples about interactions between the sexes. So there is a great weight of tradition that will tend to humiliate the male.
Your father was very interested in populist genres, but he would declare it. He would write a crime novel or a science fiction novel. I hadn't realized the extent to which you have used those genres. So Time's Arrow, we have an element of science fiction in that it goes backwards. London Fields, in which a woman colludes in her own death, is a kind of murder novel. So you have taken on those generic structures, but without being as open about it.
Without actually being much interested in the form. I used to be interested in science fiction, but the novel Night Train, for instance, is a sort of policier, a noir policier, but I can't have read more than half dozen of those in my life. Kingsley, you know, the truth is that Kingsley regarded the novel as actually a form very junior to the poem, and thought that its role was mainly that of entertainment.
Well, he once said Dick Francis was the greatest living English novelist, didn't he?
Yeah, and also he said to me proudly one day, quite late on, he said, I've decided I'm never going to read another novel that doesn't begin with the sentence, "A shot rang out." And that's what he liked to read. And when people say, weren't you upset that he didn't read your fiction? I'd say that he doesn't read any fiction. He reads thrillers. You know, if you asked him who his favorite novelist was, he'd say Anthony Poe, and then he'd be really rather stuck to come up with anyone. Didn't like Dickens, you know, didn't like Nabokov, didn't like Saul, didn't like all the people I like. So it was not that wounding when he sort of turned out not to read me. He read Time's Arrow in a day, and was very nice about it, but I'm sure that was because it did have an element of science fiction, and that it was a kind of puzzle and an inversion of reality of the kind he liked. But even the novel dedicated to him, London Fields, he, despite my mother, who was by then his housekeeper in old age, standing over him with a knife, he didn't get beyond about page 20 of that.
Looking back now at these 14 books, and Money does feel like a pivotal novel in that before that you were writing the kind of length of books your father had written, 230, 240 pages, social comedies, really. And then there is a step up. It's a much bigger book, Money, and something does happen with Money, I think.
I had the worst attack of writer's angst about it when I loved writing it. It was 3 years. And then I began the routine of reading it through before delivering it to my agent. And usually that took a day. This one took 2 days, 2.5 days, and I read it in an absolute sepsis of horror that what I'd done. And what I'd done, it became clear, was put all the eggs into the basket of voice with nothing else. And if the voice didn't work, then it was a disaster, and the voice seemed to me not to work. But I took it in, I delivered it. A few pages I rewrote in, sweating with shame. And then I delivered it and expected a white van to pull up outside my flat and white-coated operatives to fan out over the property to take me in, to section me. But it didn't turn out that way. But I was suddenly very sickeningly conscious of the gamble that I would never have sort of undertaken consciously, but I just found that that's what I'd done. And then suddenly a long novel became, a natural alternative to these well-behaved shorter novels. And it certainly was an expansion, and a cisatlantic expansion. It was to try and to bring to the English novel something of the sort of reckless energy of the Americans. There is only one way to get good at fighting. You have to do it a lot. The reason why most people are no good at fighting is that they do it so seldom, and in these days of high specialization, no one really expects to be good at anything unless they work out at it and put in some time. With violence, you have to keep your hand in. You have to have a repertoire. When I was a kid growing up in Trenton, New Jersey, and later on the streets of Pimlico, I learned these routines one by one. For instance, can you butt people, i.e. hit them in the face with your face, a very intimate form of fighting with tremendous power to appall and astonish. I took up butting when I was 10. After a while, after butting a few people, you try to hit them with your rug line, hit them in the nose, mouth, cheekbone. It doesn't much matter. I thought, yeah, I can butt people now. From then on, butting people was suddenly an option. Ditto with ball kneeing, shin kicking, and eye forking. They were all new ways of expressing frustration, fury, and fear, and of settling arguments in my favor.
It was also the first of your novels, I think, that your father absolutely could never have written, let alone read. He could never have written it. The earlier books, as we get further away, I think Rachel Papers and Lucky Jim are closer than they are far apart. But Money, you become entirely your own writer, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think the Rachel Papers and Lucky Jim are separated really just by generation, and if he'd been me and I'd been him, we would have written something very like each other's first novel. But the Money was different, and interestingly, Kingsley read the first chapter, quite a long 30-page chapter, in Granta, I think, sort of separate from the book. And he said, it's good. It's going to be longish, right? He said, and I said, yeah. And then he started to read it, and then the minute the Martin Amis character came in, then he sent it windmilling through the air, and that was the excuse. He needed to stop reading it. But I think you're right. It is. It's the novel where you, and most writers have such a novel where, certainly most American writers, where you stop being well-behaved and you stop having the sense that you're an apprentice.
Was it difficult, do you think, for your siblings, and this would not be in any way your fault, it would just be a fact, that they had Kingsley Amis and they had Martin Amis, and then they were trying to live as civilians, but with that name and those connections? What was that difficult for them, do you think?
Yeah, my brother said I'm the son of a hardback and the brother of a paperback, he said. I think it probably is and was irritating. But I'm absolutely certain that my sister Sally never felt anything but, mild pleasure and interest. Certainly, with Kingsley, she worshipped Kingsley, and after he died, she had a little sort of shrine in her flat with books and mementos of his. And you know, Kingsley unforgettably said, towards the end of his life, he said, what haunts his worst insomnias, he said to me, is that what Sally will do after I'm dead, in that there will be a great loss of raison d'etre. And she lived for another 5 years after he died. But if those two facts were at all connected, then it seems to me absolutely a tragic thing.
You talked about Sally's close relationship with Kingsley. Some people might think that you were very forgiving towards him, but your obvious love for your father and what you've said and written about him, it overcame his failure to read your books, the fact that in his published letters he refers to you as a little shit in a letter to Philip Larkin.
That's completely affectionate, the little shit. Admiring and affectionate. No, it's taken me a while to realize just how unusual it was to have a good relationship with your father during this time. And all my male friends were having battles with their fathers. And I'm absolutely convinced that it was because of the sexual revolution, in that, you know, number one rule on the Revolutionary Manifesto was, very easy to understand, there will be sex before marriage. And all my male friends during this time were having that kind of struggle with their father. I didn't have a trace of it from him. He, in fact, you know, slightly went too far the other way in his obvious approval of promiscuity in any form.
Although he gave you one of the most striking pieces of paternal advice I've ever heard, which was that he told you and your brother the sensations of sex are greatly enhanced by the feelings of love.
Yeah, and as Saul Bellows has written, it's an exceptionally smart man who can forget the sexual advice given to him by his father. You know, it's with you all your life. But I mean, this is, again, slightly facetious, but my brother and I immediately started trying to fall in love to get better sex. And it was very good advice in that it obviously true up to point, but it did make you seek love, and I think that was always the quest. It wasn't for numbers of women. It was trying to find one you loved and one you could be yourself with. That was the battle. Someone with whom you could be effortlessly yourself, and that, you know, is and always will be hard to do.
But one aspect of your relationship with your father, which I think is very unusual, he, as they would probably have said in Wales at the time when he was there, he suffered with his nerves and he had night terrors, and you would be led in as a child to calm him down. He
would be led into my room, and I never quite clear what it was about, although he did look rather odd, and these visits were usually preceded by screaming fits from the parental bedroom, you know, really high-pitched, sort of desperate screaming, whinnying. And he described it to me later. He said it's depersonalization, that he used to wake up and not know that he was a person in some weird way. He was phobic, there's no doubt about it, all his life. He never drove, he never flew. He could not be in a house after dark alone, and not just anyone would do it. Have to be family or close friend. And he once hailed a cab in Newcastle and said, "Drive me to London," because he couldn't face the train, and he had this, or even the tube train. He had this idea that he would suddenly be alone in a carriage, and he would go from carriage to carriage and find he was alone on the entire train. So, I mean, quite disabling and distorting, and something that always had to be considered throughout his life. And so I think my brother as well, we were sort of on the lookout for these recurrence of these phobias in ourselves and, again, in our children. but they haven't recurred.
Your sister clearly, though, had inherited or had some fragility.
She was a peculiar case, and I think what happened was she went to live in America when she was barely a teenager, when she was 12, 13, and in Michigan, and fell in with, and was always very difficult to control, even as a baby, you know. Fell in with, she was going to rock concerts in Detroit with, you know, Hell's Angels in a truck, you know, that sort of life. And when she came back 2 years later, she seemed to me very changed, and I think she probably took a lot of powerful, mind-altering drugs during that period, and it sort of seemed, it seems facile, but seemed to trap her at that age, and she never really advanced beyond that age.
Your dad was clearly also a considerable drinker. Have you had to watch that in yourself?
Oh, I think, you know, if you're English, then you have to watch it for that reason. We're the drunkest people in Europe, and probably, maybe certain Scandinavian enclaves are out drinkers, but we are like all northern peoples, susceptible to that. But Kingsley was a fully functional heavy drinker. He wasn't an alcoholic. It didn't change his mood, drink. It made him a bit, you know, assertive, but didn't change his character, change his personality. Whereas my sister, it did, and she became unrecognizable after a couple of drinks.
Your very close relationship with him, it survived the famously divisive fact that your parents split up when you were young. But again, there doesn't seem to be any anger at him for that.
There was at the time. You know, it was all very tearful and upsetting, and that sense you had. Remember, it was not. We weren't living in London. We were living in Cambridge. You know, none of my friends had divorced parents. If I'd been living in London, it wouldn't have seemed out of the way at all. But you know how deeply group conscious children are. And when my mother told me that they were going to get a divorce, it seemed like absolutely the end of the world. I mean, a disaster. But we recovered quite quickly, and Kingsley said that the fact that his children forgave him for that is one of the reasons why he said, I'm still around, you know. And I've repeated that experience, and it's potentially hugely destructive for you when you leave, that you know, you still feel very guilty about it, and just sorry that you've caused pain to young people, you know, very young people. It's a terrible thing. But you know, you stay until you can't stay, and these things happen.
The cover of Experience, which probably wouldn't be allowed now, but it shows you as a young boy smoking.
Well, it's not lit, you'll notice.
No.
It might well have been. We got one on Christmas Day and one on our birthdays.
But it suggests quite a free upbringing.
It was, you know, low-middle Bohemia was the milieu, which was quite testing in Swansea in the 50s, you know, where I longed for a mother who had a bowl of fruit in her hat, you know, and dressed in a suit, and that my mother would come to school in jeans and flip-flops, and all my friends thought she was great, you know, very young. My mother and I are almost the same age, you know. And, you know, there would be fairly drunken and rowdy parties at home, and the kitchen absolutely covered in wine glasses the next morning. And I remember my brother saying, "Oh, it's breakfast in the wine shop, is it?" And a very hungover parents, you know. And it was, compared to Swansea, it was very free, and compared to the rest of Cambridge, it was very free. It wouldn't have looked that odd in London, but I was conscious, it was godless house. It was, there was absolutely nothing about religion. I never heard a word about religion. And I remember filling out a form, school form, and a moment of panic where it said religion. I went and shouted upstairs, and Mom, what religion are we? And there's a long silence, and she said, C of E. It's good old C of E, didn't ask anything of you. So it did feel, you know, if you'd been aware of it, like a sort of, you know, vanguard type of household, you know, modern, more modern than those around you.
You were lucky with your stepmother in a particular respect, Elizabeth Jane Howard. She made you a reader and therefore, I assume, helped you to be a writer. I met recently Peter James, who is now a best-selling crime writer, and he remembers being at a crammer with you at one point, and you were, educationally, you had to be rescued.
Our education was all over the place, and I went to 15 different schools, and one in America and one in Mallorca, which, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I don't at all regret that. But by the time I got to 15 or so, I was failing an O-level every other year was my sort of progress chart. And Jane Howard sort of took me in hand and began feeding me novels, beginning with Pride and Prejudice. It was plain sailing from then on. I took to it and became a reader. And then I had this year in a boarding crammer. It wasn't just a crammer, boarding crammer. I mean, real sort of last gasp saloon that was. But I was ready and did all my exams, and including Oxford entrance in a year, and found I had, you know, an awful lot of awoken energy from all those years of rereading comics.
And the first published novel was, you were 24, Rachel Papers, 1973. Was that the first attempt at serious writing, or were there abandoned manuscripts?
No, that was it. That was the first shot. And I wrote it quite quickly while doing a job, mostly at the TLS. And I felt I had to write it quickly before I forgot what being a teenager was like, because he's 19 during most of the book, and he's turned 20 at the end of it. I must say, I've tried to look at it since, and it seems to me lively enough, but so crude technically that it's painful for me to read it. But it was a start.
Hello.
Hi.
An American? Well, we can drop the accent bit. I noticed that you don't have a drink.
Are you giving this party?
Certainly not. Parties of this kind are not given, they're received. Man comes and drinks the wine, lies beneath, and after many a summer dies the swine. Tennyson said that. Look, how about that drink?
No, thanks, I've got one.
No, I meant maybe somewhere else. I mean, look at all these people. I mean, obviously, most of them are gay crashes. Who's giving this party, anyway?
I am, actually, and I don't remember inviting you.
Oh, well, the name's Highway. Charles Highway.
The last sentence of that novel is, "I refill my pen," which is very much a statement of intent, that, you know, this is just the beginning, and it's not going to just be this. On we go. And by the time it came out, I was very much immersed in my second novel.
The style of the early books, there is clearly a project to remake English. I mean, a title you later used, The War Against Cliché, for a book of essays. It's American influenced, I suppose, but it's getting away from the classic English sentences. I mean, it's often been quoted, but it's very apposite, the conversation you had with your father where he said he wanted more sentences in your books, such as they walked across the room and poured themselves a drink, and you were determined not to write them. But it was fresh expression in every sentence, if possible.
Yeah, he called that remorseless vividness. he says, which exhausts the reader. And I always said that he should have fewer sentences like that in his stuff, and maybe I should have one or two, but he should definitely have fewer. It's not sort of worked up, it's not cranked up, it's just how a sentence seems to ask you to write it. It's not an effort of will, it's sometimes an effort of patience.
The case against the books which people have mounted, it started quite early on, the charge of coldness. Now, it's very odd to anyone who's read a lot of you and has met you over the years, because you are quite an emotional person, I think, and quite an emotional writer. But that charge, I think, came from the energy, the aggression of the writing.
I don't know whether it was a question of when you were born or what the traditions that fed into you were, but there was always a feeling that you should control emotion very carefully. You thought there's plenty there, but it is controlled. But I think someone asked me what did my novels learn from, as so to speak, from writing experience, a memoir. And I suppose it was that emotion should be more present, or you should not seek to control it quite so sternly, that you should give it a bit more elbow room. And I think this novel and its predecessor, House of Meetings, do indulge feeling a bit more than I would have felt happy with years ago.
Another charge which came quite early on was of misogyny. I remember having these arguments with girlfriends in the past. We don't read Martin Amis. Martin Amis is a man's writer, but I think, looking back and reading them again, there was a misunderstanding that you are honest about the male psyche and male behavior with grotesque comic exaggeration. The assumption of a lot of people was that you were endorsing it all.
When an issue gets politicized, then there are all these sort of triggers that set off alarm bells. And if you in your novel you have something about rape or something of that kind, then alarm bells go off. And I know what it's like to be politicized. I've occasionally got politicized on certain questions, and it's very distorting. The misogyny objection is partly a response to the genre, which is social realism shading into satire, where everything's exaggerated again, more intensely. And you're just not going to get the woman character who has 5 children and a high-powered job and is also, a very interesting amateur painter. You're not going to get her. What would she be doing in a book by me,
It's possible that, having read a lot of your novels again in sequence for this interview, it is possible to take away the depressing conclusion that cooperative monogamy between men and women is in the end impossible, that there will be either sexual desire or differing expectations will destroy it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the institution of marriage exactly parallels what Churchill said about democracy. Marriage is the worst possible arrangement between a man and a woman, except for all the others. But I've been very lucky in the end, second time. I have great respect for the institution of marriage. I don't see it working universally well all around me, but it can work, and it's a marvelous thing. And nothing is better than, I don't want to sound like David Cameron, but nothing is better than having your children and your wife in middle-class comfort. It is a desirable goal.
And in The Pregnant Widow, the most recent novel, I thought it had an interesting relationship with your second novel, Dead Babies, which is set in the 70s and is about a group of young people spending time together, not in such magnificent surroundings, perhaps. Was there a conscious relationship? And did you think of returning to that time and that setting?
It did occur to me that this is a country house weekend novel, just as Dead Babies was. although the suspense there was who was the murderer, as is usual in those novels. But the suspense in this novel is not about a death, it's about a sexual act. Kenrick, too, was the child of a pregnant widow. It happened early on in the second trimester, fast convertible, summer rain. So, for 5 months, the vanished father, the unborn son, and the mother both lamenting and expecting, the black weeds or threads, but also the familiar curve of the silhouette, with the profile poised like a question mark between life and death. And the old order gives way to the new, not immediately though, not yet. The filled breasts and weakened knees, the cravings, the broken waters, the pumping womb, and labor, labor, labor.
I also know from interviewing you on and off for almost 20 years now that The Pregnant Widow was originally a very different book. It was declared as an openly autobiographical novel in which there was a version of you, there was a version of Saul Bellow, there were direct versions of other people. But all that has gone, that was thrown out.
It was abandoned. I had a terrible couple of weeks where I realized that this endless novel I was writing, and that had no end in sight and was already, you know, perhaps 600-700 pages, was dead. Now, it's a funny quality. When you're writing about life and trying to make it fiction of some kind, certainly not a memoir, life is dead, isn't it? Isn't that peculiar? It lies there inert and turgid because it's not, you know, what the novelist does is inject symmetries and epiphanies and bestiaries and unities above all, and streamlines reality so that it tells, you know, so that it can be told in an enjoyable way and stimulating way. But life is just one damn thing after another. So I had to face up to this, and I abandoned it. And I thought for a couple of weeks, that is my writing life over. But then I, you know, tiptoed back to it and realized that it was, in fact, 2 books, 2 novels. This is one bit of it, and and not autobiographical. And that's why it was a bit in it was an oasis of fiction in this autobiographical novel. It was something I had largely made up. And I liked it because it was fictional. So I expanded that, and it was an incredible joy to get back to the freedom of fiction, where instead of being the chronicler of your own existence, you are once again in a godlike relation to what you put down on the page. You could have absolutely anything happen. And I could obey Philip Roth's dictum that you don't write about what happened, you write about what didn't happen.
And there are visible threads of autobiography still, I think, in The Pregnant Widow. We partly know this because you've written about your own life and experience. But, for example, there's a story you've told before about this great protective joy you felt when your sister Sally was born, which is given to Keith in relation to his own sister. There's a game you've described playing with your friend Christopher Hitchens in which, in a title such as Affairs of the Heart, the word heart is substituted with Dick, and there are variations on this, and that again is given to Keith. So there are still parts of it as semi-memoir.
Yes, and I gave him my height. You know, he won't thank me for that.
And he has your birth date, but 2 days displaced, I think, is it?
No, I don't remember displacing it. I think he meant to have my birthday. The original character was, of course, me, and...
was he called Martin Amis?
No. In fact, he was unnamed. But part of what was wrong with it is you can't write autobiographically about sex. It just can't be done without being, you know, disgusting or embarrassing. And what is repulsive in a first person or a localized third person account of sex is any sense of entitlement. So I had to denude him of any sense of entitlement. I made him an illegitimate orphan so that he had no kind of expectation And I made him less successful with girls. He's really had quite a lot of trouble getting girlfriends, and I had experience.
Whereas you did not.
Oh, I did for a while, just enough to know that it's a dreadful, slippery slope. That if it starts to go wrong with girls, it can go much worse, get much worse very quickly, because you begin to resent women, and you begin to feel repulsive, and that gets around, and girls can spot it across a room, this feeling of sullen unattractiveness, and then, you know, the resentment increases and the unattractiveness increases, and so I can imagine that. I had enough experience of that, thanks. But he's a character constructed for this novel, and in fact not a very assertive character.
Violet Nearing, Keith's sister, although she's a largely off-page character, she is the moral heart of this novel, because she is presented as a victim of the sexual revolution in the 70s.
Yes, I mean, Violet, and indeed my sister, would have struggled in any society. But the sexual revolution, all it did was provide the backdrop, the style and setting of that dissolution. And her terrible life was based on, promiscuity, assisted by alcohol. The Me Decade wasn't called the Me Decade until 1976. In the summer of 1970, they were only 6 months into it, but they could all be pretty sure that the 1970s was going to be a Me Decade. This was because all decades were now Me Decades. There's never been anything that could possibly be called a You Decade. Technically speaking, You Decades, back in the feudal night, would have been known as Thou Decades. The 1940s was probably the last We Decade, and all decades until 1970 were undeniably He Decades. So the Me Decade was the Me Decade, right enough, a new intensity of self-absorption. But the Me Decade was also, and unquestionably, the She Decade. What it mainly was a huge increase in possibilities, in opportunities. And of course, everyone was feeling their way. And it was the girls who had to make all the difficult choices. The girls had to change. The boys didn't have to change. They just went on being boys and had plenty of practice at that, and they were good at it. But girls were suddenly looking for a model, and I think it's called the equalitarian phase of feminism was the early bit when the orthodoxy was that men and women were the same. The clever ones sort of felt their way and found they did a bit too much of that than they really felt happy with, or they avoided it and say, no, this isn't for me. But they preserved their individuality and their identity and did not get swept up ideologically, which is what all the victims did, where they participated when their heart wasn't in it, when it wasn't really in them to do it. And you should never go against what you really are. You cannot change the sort of clay of what you are. And my sister was just a very spectacular example of how wrong it can go.
And that identification which you've made between Violet in the book and Sally, your late sister, Keith realizes at the time in the 70s how badly wrong it's going for her, but was it for you retrospective that you realized how bad things were?
No, it was very evident, and I used to talk about it with my brother in horror. And I did do what he did. I tried to withdraw emotionally from it because I knew I wouldn't be able to bear to look at it, and a completely futile attempt to muffle the love I felt for her. And I did indeed have what he had when she died. I had my handwriting collapsed for a few months, and I had a year-long sore throat. And then I felt I got over it. And then 3 years later, I had a sort of a physical collapse, after she died, and eventually come to see that that it was the strength and also the violence of very early feelings. My brother and I used to get ourselves into quite an emotional state, saying, oh, if anyone touches her, if anyone lays a finger on her. And then for all our adult lives, we had to sort of stand back and watch as everyone touched her, as everyone abused her. And you can't escape the force of those early feelings. And then it all sort of caught up with me after she died. And I had exactly what he had. I just, getting out of bed in the morning was like a Russian novel. It just took up the rest of the day. It was just, everything was a tremendous effort, just weakness and frailty. And, swearing and weeping and all the rest. And you saw the horror of it, of what had happened to her.
And it's a commonplace, in fact, of therapy now that writing about it is supposed to help. I mean, you're a professional writer, so it's different slightly, but was it more or less painful to have to write about it in The Pregnant Widow?
It was perhaps made possible by the fact that there were only two occasions in her life where my sister looked like an adult, a fully conscious adult. And not like a sort of 12-year-old or a 13-year-old. One was when Kingsley died in the hospital. She looked absolutely clear-eyed, and she could see her own future ahead of her. A very impressive look she had on her face. And another time, after I'd helped her out of some entanglement, disaster, and was sort of patching her up afterwards. This was quite late on. And she said, she obviously wanted to give me something. You could feel that she wanted to repay me in some way. And she said with that very clear look, she said, write about me. You can say anything you like, she said. You can tell, all the bad things. And I never forgot that. And I think I might have felt quite uneasy if she hadn't said that.
The Information, 1995, is seen as a pivotal book in a less happy way, that when we look back, it sort of stands out because you changed publisher, changed agent. It was when the real public kicking began over some of that. Do you look back on it with pangs now?
I look back on the whole period with pangs. It was an awful time for me because I'd left home. But I'm fond of the novel. You perhaps are fondest of the novels that either you struggled with or when they went out in the world, they struggled. And I had such difficulty with that I'm amazed it's there, really. And it was 5 years work. But the surrounding stuff is all, it's all completely extra-literary.
And you tried to avoid cliche in your writing, as we've said, but the cliche that was widely invoked at that time was midlife crisis. Many people said it specifically, new wife, new agent, new publisher, new teeth, all of that. Did any of that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, I had a midlife crisis, but I think it's something of a crisis if you don't have a midlife crisis. I think the adjustment asked of the very sources of your being is so radical that it would be creepy to get through it without some sort of cracks showing. And it's very clear to me now what that was. It's a crisis of mortality, where, if you can define youth, it's the feeling you get when you look in the mirror and you say to yourself, while I'm intellectually convinced that I will get old and die like everyone else, it does seem that you've got away with it, that it's not, in fact, going to happen to you. And as long as you can still feel that in even the sort of most frivolous parts of your brain, as long as there's still a glimmer of that, then that's your youth still there, you know, failing, shrinking. But the minute you accept this, you know, universal truth, then it is going to shake you profoundly. And you know, the novelist, unlike the poet, is a universal figure. I don't think anything's ever happened to me, or I've reacted to anything that's happened to me in a way that hundreds of millions of people, no different. The poet finds his own way, that's not true of the novelist.
The teeth, which we should just briefly mention, because it was an emblematic episode, that in that the media assumed the worst. They assumed that you were undergoing a cosmetic procedure as part of this midlife crisis. In fact, as you explained in Experience and have explained elsewhere, it was an emergency dental intervention. But that was a good example because there was a feeling, an assumption to assume the worst.
Well, I mean, assuming the worst is almost the definition of that kind of bourgeois tabloid journalism. There's a sort of cackling scurrility in that echelon of reporting. We're talking about the Mail and the Express and so on. You know, in the old days, I remember when my father got divorced, some drunken debauchee would be writing in his Fleet Street office, Kingsley Amis has betrayed his wife and he's an adulterer and so on. That was just good old hypocrisy. There's no need for hypocrisy anymore because everyone's proud of being a bastard. But we've all had periods of being given a bad time by the press, and it's like releasing a valve of philistinism and anti-intellectualism and a sort of wrecking spirit, and it's, you know, very English.
For some time now, you've been in a position where anything you say or do, divorce, dentistry, comments about Jordan the supermodel, comments about feminism at a small London literary festival, they go national, they go global, some of them now. There are headlines, there are commentators for days. Does that situation bemuse you, or have you just come to accept it?
It makes you watch your lip a bit more, but I think novelists are not like poets or journalists or academics. We should look to them to say things that are, you know, perhaps a little jarring, but that's, you know, what we're here for. And if that is unwelcome, then the novel is unwelcome.
There was a surprise to me in the more recent books, the extent to which you retreated from fiction. We had Experience, we then had Cobra the Dread, which is a work of historical analysis, Second Plane, which is essays and fiction about 9/11. Did that come from a feeling that Yellow Dog had run into at least one notoriously bad review? Was that a feeling that you were in trouble with fiction?
Well, I think I had the big rest from fiction before Yellow Dog, between The Information and, I think, Yellow Dog. And then I came back into you know, a real explosion of don't forget, it wasn't just the reviews. Anyone who could hold a pen was queuing up to, you know, like someone getting a kick in during a beating, you know. And it was completely inordinate and very, I felt for a couple of weeks as if I had flu. I mean, it was really lowering. And in my view, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the novel. It's one of my better novels, I believe.
We talked about the way you've changed as a writer. Looking at Experience, all adult lives are about additions, the arrival of children, and subtractions, deaths of loved ones, but the sheer range and extent of them is the striking thing about experience, that a daughter you didn't know you'd fathered turns up in your adult life. You discover that a cousin is one of the victims of Fred West. Subsequent to the book, we talked about the death of your sister. Do you feel battered and reshaped by all that? Because it's an unusually dramatic sequence of events.
Well, I mean, my recently discovered daughter, not so recent anymore, I said to my wife, to Isabel, I said, you know, there was a letter disclosing this fact, and she read it and she said, there's no reason why this shouldn't be an absolutely wonderful thing. And she was dead right, and so it's proved. No, that was nothing but a positive event, and she since presented me with a grandson, which is a mixed blessing in some senses, in that it also asks a readjustment of your self-image, you know, the grandfather. Not very flattering if you grew up in the time I grew up. It's not markedly cool to be a grandfather. And then the enormous and really startling anomaly of losing a first cousin who was a religious, serious, poetic, learned girl to Fred West is almost too, you know, massive an event to be absorbed. But otherwise, you know, we just do have, this is the rhythm of our lives. We are born to be orphans, and we will leave orphans behind us. And I don't think there have been an unusual amount of deaths surrounding me.
You've reached the curious position, as you know, where your omission from Man Booker Prize shortlists is reported sometimes ahead of the actual inclusions. Be as honest as you have been elsewhere. Do you care about the Man Booker and other prizes?
Well, it's become such a monster now that it would be, you know, very simplifying to win it. It would make life easier. I mean, when Kingsley won it, he said, you know, I won't hear a word said against the Booker Prize. I used to have all these objections to it, but they all seem to have evaporated in the last few minutes, he said, as he accepted the prize. And it was, you know, it was a visible fillip for him. It gave him a lot of energy and a lot of encouragement. So there are, you know, non-literary reasons for wanting to win it, but I don't feel excluded from any great pantheon.
Martin Amis, thank you very much.
Thank you.